We tend to imagine 1930s Hollywood as a factory for wholesome stories and sanitized romance. It's an era defined in our memory by predictable plots, where bad behavior is always punished and virtue is consistently rewarded. But if you walked into a movie theater in 1931, you would find a barrage of machine gun fire, crooked politicians, and women who used their wits to climb the social ladder without a hint of remorse. On this timeline, the 4-year span between 1930 and 1934 stands out as a window where talking pictures operated without moral guardrails, a brief era known as pre-code Hollywood. These films didn't happen by accident. They were a direct response to a public that had grown tired of manufactured escapism and was beginning to demand stories that felt as raw as the world outside the theater doors. The catalyst was the total collapse of the American economic system. As banks failed and life savings vanished, the physical toll of the Great Depression became impossible to ignore. This collapse left a psychological vacuum. With the system failing so spectacularly, public trust in traditional institutions and leadership hit an all-time low. Hollywood studios realized they could no longer sell idealized dreams to a population struggling to survive. To keep audiences coming back, they pivoted toward narratives that mirrored the grim, cynical reality of the streets. Pre-code films were the result of this shift, a supply and demand response for a society that refused to be patronized by sunny optimism. The defining characteristic of these early talkies was a complete lack of respect for authority figures. On screen, the pillars of society were shown to be thoroughly rotten. Politicians functioned as puppets for gangsters, police officers were frequently incompetent, and even judges were portrayed as easily bought or distracted from their duties. In films like The Public Enemy, the true villains weren't just the criminals on the corner. They were the powerful men in high society suits who enabled the corruption to happen. These stories rarely ended with the system correcting itself. There were no mandatory happy endings where justice was restored to a broken world. The message was a lesson in survivalism. In a world where the people in charge are corrupt or indifferent, you have to look out for yourself. Perhaps the most radical element of this era was its depiction of women. Female protagonists in 1931 were not helpless maidens. They were written as highly intelligent, sexually aware survivalists who were never punished for having their own ambitions. In Red-Headed Woman, Jean Harlow played a character who actively broke social rules to secure wealth and status, and the film allowed her to succeed without ever forcing her to repent. These women understood the rules of a male-dominated world and turned those rules to their absolute advantage, operating with a level of freedom that stunned moral guardians. Because these characters succeeded on their own terms, they became symbols of agency for an audience that felt increasingly powerless in their own lives. This creative Wild West came to a sudden halt in July 1934. Under the weight of intense boycotts from religious groups, the studios finally surrendered their independence. The industry appointed Will Hayes to formalize the Motion Picture Production Code, giving him the authority to manage the studio's growing public morality crisis. They also brought in Joseph Breen, a strict enforcer who ensured that every script and every scene followed the code's uncompromising moral requirements. This comparison chart shows the immediate impact of the Don'ts and Be Carefuls document, which systematically scrubbed studio slates of themes involving unpunished corruption or female independence. The shift to safe cinema was an overnight mandate, forced onto a creative industry to avoid financial ruin. The character fallout was immediate. Ambitious women were forced back into roles of domesticity, and crooked cops were replaced by idealized heroes who always upheld the law. The dangerous, honest energy of the early 30s was replaced by a sanitized cinematic landscape that dominated the American screen for the next 3 decades. Because they were made before the code took hold, these films remain a vital historical capsule, a rare moment when Hollywood was allowed to be honest about human nature. The polite, wholesome images of the decades that followed were the result of direct censorship, leaving the brief pre-code era as the most authentic record of a nation's cynicism ever captured on film. This was brought to you by Stalls or Circle. Thank you for listening.